Welcome to Casey Cares. We're Kansas City's nonprofit voice, and we're telling those stories of Kansas City nonprofits and the people behind them. Casey Cares is the intersection of the nonprofit and profit communities, making Kansas City a better place to live, work, and play. This Casey Cares segment is brought to you by the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation, www.kaufman.org. I'm Ruth Von Biggis. Taking the temperature on charitable giving is what the annual Giving USA report is all about, providing that snapshot of national philanthropic trends. The Giving USA annual report is the longest running and most comprehensive look at philanthropy, and it provides in-depth analysis of charitable giving, where it comes from and how funds are used. This year's report tells us that $557.16 billion was given to charity, but there's more to that number than just that big total. Insights from the report are a great tool for those in the world of the nonprofit fundraising community and their programming partners. And as we've done for several years here on Casey Cares, we're here to unwrap what this all means for the nonprofit sector. And joining us to provide her excellent insight into the report and advice for nonprofits is Dr. Una Osili. She's the Associate Dean of Research and International Programs and the Ephraimson Chair of Economics and Philanthropy at the Lilly School of Philanthropy at Indiana University. The Giving USA report is a product of her team at the Lilly Family School. They eat, sleep, breathe everything Giving USA report. So welcome back.
Thank you for having me. It's such a delight and an honor to be on this show with you and to share the latest insights from the report.
Well, I have to tell you that number is extraordinary. It sounds like indescribable amounts of money. Let's dive into that a little bit, though. This year that reports on 2023 numbers, is that correct?
Correct. So Giving USA provides an estimate of the previous year's giving. As you know, we have been through a tumultuous period. Many of us are still unwrapping, as you said, what this period means. We had a global pandemic. Of course, COVID is still very much in many communities, so it's not completely out of the way. But we've also had economic shocks, a recession in 2020, some recovery during that period, and also a lot of concerns globally about justice and racial equity and all of that. So when we put it all together, really an unprecedented time for American philanthropy. And while many were unsure about how this would affect giving, I think we can start with celebrating the fact that giving actually grew during this period, reaching this new level, as we noted, which is almost, it's definitely over the $500 billion mark. And it's quite amazing to reflect and think about the size, the complexity, and also underlying those numbers, the generosity of Americans. And I stress this because we're at a time when, of course, there's a lot of talk about polarization and discord and lack of cohesion in many of our communities. But I think this is also a moment to celebrate what does bring us together. And for many American households, families of all different backgrounds, race, ethnicities, religious orientation, and so forth, there is a common thread that unites us, and that's this commitment to generosity. Generosity is a core value that many Americans share, and that over $500 billion mark is something that we really should pause, at least at this moment, and celebrate.
Yay! It's so lovely to hear somebody from a positive bent, since there's so much negative noise and sound and all of that. I know when we spoke about this last year, we were truly just, on the heels of coming out of pandemic, masking, shutdowns, all of that. And you all are studying this like all year. This isn't like, oh, let's just run some numbers and some spreadsheets. Okay, here it is. What are you pulling from? Where does this data come, and how do you churn it to get to what we'll talk about next, which is what the numbers are.
Yes, let me take you behind the scenes, and I'm always delighted to share this unpacking of the data. So, Giving USA relies on several important data sources. We rely on data from the government. We also rely on data collected on American households and foundations and nonprofits, the reports from nonprofits, the Form 990s. We put all this together. We, over the years, have developed some models, econometric models that actually are built on the underlying data. Giving USA, of course, provides information based on American households, foundations, corporations, and also charitable bequests. So there are areas where our data sources are more limited. And in that case, we've developed ways of estimating. So this has been over the course of many decades now of behind the scenes work. But we are actually very pleased to share that one of the core data sources, which is the philanthropy panel study, of American households, has been in existence now for over 2 decades. So we have what is really quite unparalleled longitudinal data. That means data every single year, every other year on American families of all different backgrounds. So when you put this all together, in addition to celebrating generosity, I think it's important to note that to get these estimates, our team works in collaboration with many entities, including, as I said, government data sources, our philanthropy panel study, as well as even government data to get at what some of these numbers are and what they mean.
How fascinating for somebody who must have worked on this a long time, and how the tools have been refined and made easier. And then we have that big thing looming over here called AI. Has AI come into this mix of how you pull any data, or how you pull, summary about data?
It's a very good question. We are watching very carefully how AI can be used for some of these data tools. Not as yet, we haven't used AI, but in some other projects of ours, we are using AI on the cleaning side. Usually, this is for folks who are inside the sausage making, as they say. Data cleaning is something that's very labor intensive, time intensive, and also requires a fair amount of, I'd say, really very careful, intensive work. And so, one way that we've really thought about how AI can help us here is as a collaborator, essentially helping check and fact check some of those data points. And so I am actually excited about the possibility of bringing AI into some of these processes, just given the amount of time, share, man and woman power that they require. But we're not quite there yet.
All right. Enough about process. I know everybody's just waiting. Let's jump into these numbers, this billions of dollars. So as a global look at the report this year, we're giving more, but things have shifted a little bit. Tell us about some of that shift, sources, all the things that you know.
Yes. So every year we have a chance not just to look at the current period, but also to look back and to look ahead. And so let me start with just the high level takeaways. So giving grew, but did not keep pace with inflation. So, as many of you know, we have had a period of relatively high inflation. Actually, the last few years, we've had inflation levels that we haven't seen, have to go back to the 1970s to see the levels of inflation. So while giving has grown, it has not kept pace with inflation. So that's a big story. What does this mean for everyone? It means that, of course, American households, even though they've seen their incomes grow and they've seen a lot of their economic circumstances improve, for many households, those wage increases are also somewhat, I'd say, moderated because they've also had to pay higher prices for food and for housing in some communities and so forth. So that tempers a bit of our excitement about the numbers. But then when we dig deeper into where the giving is coming from, there's some really interesting insights that emerge. So individuals, American households, are still the largest slice of the pie, as it were. And this is also something that has an important takeaway, meaning giving is still about connecting with individuals, about the people that give, that make up this big generosity as we have shared. And when we look at that individual slice, it is under 70%, which is it's now about 67%, which is the lowest level we've seen since we started tracking the data. So, uh,
Wow.
yeah, very interesting. And why has this shift taken place? When we started collecting this data back in the 1950s, of course, I was not part of the project back then, but we've been able to go back. Individuals made up 85% of all giving, meaning their
Wow.
share has kind of fallen over time. And what has taken up that percentage has been foundation. So American philanthropy has become more complex. It has more institutional forms of giving are part of the mix these days. And we also have, as we look at the foundation slice, we have charitable bequests are also a big piece of the puzzle. In other words, it's not just Americans that are alive, but also individuals that are deceased are part of the giving landscape. And charitable bequests are now almost 10%, actually 10% in this year's report. And that is actually an increase. And then finally, corporations. Kansas City has a lot of companies that play a big role in the charitable giving equation. And we've seen corporate giving grow, especially during the pandemic. Many corporations really stepped up their giving, but it is still the smallest share of the pie at around 6%. So when we look back in the 50s and 60s, the corporate giving segment accounted for about 5%. So I tend to think about that slice as kind of staying the same in terms of its contributions to overall charitable giving. However, corporations are also innovating. They are using giving tools in different ways. They're engaging in impact investing. They're matching gifts that their employees give. Many of them are partnering with nonprofits in new ways. You may have heard about, of course, all the sponsorships that take place and marketing that takes place, and even we are seeing a lot of these, what would I'd call them just a cause marketing, where companies partner with nonprofits around a particular cause. So lots of ways to engage companies. Not all of that is through the traditional philanthropy bucket. So I think this is just an exciting time for both as a nonprofit researcher, but as someone who also cares about the sector, to see all the new ways that all the different forms of giving are contributing.
I'd like to go back to bequests for a moment, which are up. What do you attribute that to? Are we smarter? Are organizations doing different things? Why is that happening? I mean, people die. I get that. That's a constant. We know that happens.
Yes. Yes, it's a very good question. So let me just spend some time on it. Charitable bequests tend to be the more volatile part of giving because that segment does move around from year to year based on the closing and timing of some large estates. However, we are in a moment where our age distribution is worth stopping to pay attention for a minute.
Mhm.
We have a growing number of older Americans who are living longer, who are also having more productive lives in that next phase. But what we also want to emphasize is that they are reaching their peak giving years. In other words, they are at the point where they're planning their legacies, they're making these charitable bequests, and we are projecting that charitable bequests are an area of growth. So for many nonprofits who have not invested in legacy gifts, planned gifts, I'd say this is a time to really step up in that domain, because we are seeing with more older Americans more potential for those large bequests. And for many organizations who have made those investments, so they already started these down this road, they're already starting to see that investments in the planned giving area have started to be an area of growth for them. So some important takeaways from the data this year: charitable bequests, that segment actually grew and kept pace with inflation. And if we look ahead, we expect and project that with more and more Americans certainly reaching that period of making these large gifts, when we look at the data more closely, we see that the savings and wealth levels for that older bracket has also grown. For example, as a data point, Americans 55 and older, their savings increased by about 30%. So the pandemic had this, you could say, the silver lining is that many households in the older demographic, especially, had accumulated assets and they didn't spend as much because they weren't
Hmm.
traveling, they weren't going on vacations, and so forth. So a lot of those discretionary expenses they were able to save. And this may be just a very, I'd say, opportune moment for nonprofits to start really investing in those plan giving programs and building the relationships around plan giving.
Let's talk about foundations. What's
Yeah.
our takeaway there? And how should nonprofits be looking at that as potential funding if they're not already receiving funding there?
Yes, well, foundations are also a very important story in this year's report because we see again, and this is the second year in a row that we've seen this, foundations now account for 20% of all charitable giving, which means, let's put it in practical terms, 1 out of every 5 charitable dollars comes from a foundation. And what this means for nonprofits is that developing relationships with both individuals and foundations is going to be part of the strategy, not just now, but going forward. Why? Because many foundations have also seen with the stock market growing, and in 2023, we had, even adjusting for inflation, about 20% growth in foundation assets, meaning foundations are now more so, perhaps even than even before the COVID period, in a very, I'd say, positive uh, place where they've seen several years of appreciation in their asset values, and they are really thinking about how to give. Many corporations and foundations, I mentioned corporations, but for foundations, we also saw some innovation in how they're giving, with foundations making more unrestricted gifts, multi-year commitments, and also experimenting with partnerships where I think examples like McKinsey's Prague, where she gave unrestricted all her giving just as a point in 2020 alone, $6 billion. All of that was unrestricted. So when we look at foundations, we're seeing not just this opportunity there, but also the innovation. One way to think about it is foundations have really stepped up in this era, but they have stepped forward and experimented with new ways of building partnerships. I'll just mention, though, that the foundation segment also covers both what we tend to think of as family foundations, which are
Mm-hmm.
not run by professional staff. Usually it's just 1 or 2 family members that are making decisions, as well as larger foundations. And I know Kansas City has many of those more
Yes, we
professional,
do.
yes, including some of them that are part of the landscape. So for nonprofits who are thinking, well, where do I start? It's important to distinguish between the professionally run staffed foundations that may have strategic areas of focus and may also be very much involved in signature initiatives, and how to approach those foundations may also differ from working more closely with family foundations, where that relationship may be very similar to working with an individual donor. So in some ways, you can take a lot of what you learn individuals and also use that when working with family foundations, building relationships, establishing trust, and also showing how your organization is moving the needle on the issues that that foundation is engaged in.
Oh, you've given me so many ideas for future programs talking about foundations and the differences and all of that. So thank you for that very much. Let's get into when you were in Kansas City and you did a whole presentation, which was actually just marvelous. It was, if you didn't get to go, folks, you're getting the highlights here. But you were really able to dive down into particular areas, both of the growth and things that had gone away. And the one thing that sticks out in my mind, I remember part of the conversation about religious institutions and what's happened with giving there. Can we go down some of those things and what the observations were from the report?
Yes, well, the report actually showcases a very important segment of American philanthropy, and that is religious congregations, houses of worship, whether those are churches, synagogues, mosques. They are important destinations of American philanthropy. And when we look back, it's striking. Two-thirds of all charitable giving went to churches, synagogues, congregations back in the 50s and 60s. That was the primary destination of American giving. Many households, when they thought about where to give, often their congregation was where they started and ended up most of the time. Today, that has shifted. I would say when I think about disruption in philanthropy, that actually stands out in my mind because today it's actually about 27% of all giving. So less than a third from that high of two-thirds goes to churches and synagogues. One way that you could look at the data is to say, looks like religion is losing its market share from being the number one destination. It's still the number one destination, but occupying a much smaller footprint in the charitable giving landscape. However, that may be overly simplistic. Do know that many households are drawn to philanthropy because of their faith traditions. They're giving because of their faith and their beliefs and their value system that's often rooted in how they were raised and the religious traditions that they grew up in. In addition, when we look at the histories of so many of our charitable institutions, everything from the colleges and universities to a lot of the human services organizations to even environmental groups and healthcare institutions. Many of them have a faith based component to them, hospitals, daycare centers, and so forth. So we do see that there's still a very strong influence of faith and faith based organizations in our landscape today. However, I think we have seen a significant shift. And in the time period, we've seen a lot of other organizations become important destinations, leading destinations, in fact, for many people's largest gifts and not simply restricted to their congregation.
Well, I see behind you that Indiana, cardinal red, and off to my side is my Michigan blue. So let's talk about education and giving there and what you see, and maybe a little bit of what you see in the future. It's been a rocky year in higher ed in some aspects. So,
Absolutely, very complex and turbulent time for higher education. And that's also a place where we've seen some shifts. Higher education and education more broadly is has been for a long time the second largest destination for American giving. In other words, many households after their congregations tend to prioritize their institutions of higher learning. And what we've seen in this year's report is that education was no longer the second, it actually was the third. So I don't
mm,
want to really push that too far because education is still one of the top areas of giving. But we've also seen declining trust in higher education, where people give to institutions of trust. And as more households have questions and skepticism around higher ed, I think we're seeing some of that affecting giving. The good news, however, I think for higher education is that many Americans are also very committed to supporting the institutions. And what is exciting about this time for higher education is when we look at who's giving to higher education, especially for the large donors, not all of them went to that university. You see non alumni also stepping up and seeing universities as a place where partnerships can take place. Over the
yes.
last few years, there's been a lot of discussion about the rising cost of higher ed and the affordability question. But then we've also seen many donors increase their commitments just this week. We heard the big donation of Michael Bloomberg to Johns Hopkins, specifically to help make medical school more affordable. So I think just as we have the questions, the challenges, and the skepticism around higher education, we've also seen that higher ed can be a place where donors can really partner with institutions to help solve big problems, whether those problems are affordability, healthcare. I'm also very encouraged because during the COVID crisis, we saw a lot of educational institutions also play a role in innovation and research. I love one of the gifts from COVID was Dolly Parton made $1 million gift to Vanderbilt University around COVID research. So the good news here is that higher ed remains a place, perhaps unique in its ability to solve problems. At the same time, we also know that donors give and people give when they trust institutions. And building trust, accountability, transparency, some of those terms that we all know very well are going to be even more important in the future.
Seems that trust thing is getting harder and harder to do. Who took a really big hit? What areas really, it's like, warning flags, caution flags, whatever. Being an indie there, we'll use a little lingo for racetrack. Who should be a little concerned? By who I mean, what kind of areas of philanthropy should be on the watch?
So, two areas that we did see some declines, and I think worth emphasizing: religious congregations saw a decline in their giving. I think this is really a function of the fact that a lot of congregations are still recovering from the COVID crisis. Many of them have not necessarily switched to more online forms of giving and even online forms of engagement because we found that, congregations that move to virtual services, virtual ways of giving have been able to bounce back, but attendance levels are still down in many congregations. And so religious congregations, I think, looking ahead, will need to really think about how to build not just the in-person, this idea of a pivot. Many organizations have had to do this, and I think congregations are in this group. Another group that we've seen in this year's report, which has been doing quite well, but 2023 took a little bit of a hit, were international organizations. And that's because we saw a big uptick in giving around the war in Ukraine in particular, where many Americans supported and gave to humanitarian relief in Ukraine in particular, and to support some of the humanitarian efforts there. But in 2023, as the headlines have kind of shifted, and there's so many more issues, perhaps on the domestic front, that Americans are supporting, we've seen some tapering off of that support for Ukraine. And I think that's showing up in the numbers. So for international organizations, one concern is that with so many domestic crises, wildfires, flooding, even most recently in Texas and elsewhere, it seems like the new perhaps way of thinking about disasters is that it's becoming just more commonplace, which also creates a lot of urgency for many households around supporting perhaps crises that are closer to home, and that may put some pressure on international giving. But on the other side, I think it's worth noting that Americans are very generous. As we've noted, when we look at younger Americans, they're drawn to international causes. And so there's still an opportunity to continue to engage. I think the question is also how some of those crises are presented to the public in the media may affect the philanthropic response as well.
We have just about run out of time. There's so much more. Where is somewhere people can go if they want to know more about the report, drill down, etc.?
The great news here is that we just barely scratched the surface. As you noted, there's a lot to unwrap and unpack in this year's report. But the Giving USA website, givingusa.org, has the executive summary, has the infographic. And if you are someone who loves data and want to download data tables, those are available. And just probably this month, the entire book will be available as well. So you can, of course, just grab the highlights. But if you want to dig deeper, that's also an option.
Thank you, Dr. Osley, for being our expert. And we have to wait a whole year, but I can't wait to see what comes next.
Well, it's been such a joy and a pleasure to spend this time with you and also to learn more about what's happening in Kansas City. Really excited to continue this conversation and to see all the great things that are happening in Kansas City as well.
Thank you for joining us on KC Cares, Kansas City's nonprofit voice. We're produced by Charitable Communications, which is also a nonprofit. And this KC Cares segment was brought to you by the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation, www.kaufman.org. If you'd like to be a guest on KC Cares, please visit our website. You'll find all kinds of things there, kccaresonline.org. And spread the love. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at KC Cares Radio and Instagram on KC Cares Online. And don't forget, you can catch us Saturday mornings at 8 a.m. on ESPN 1510 a.m. and 94.5 FM. Thank you for joining us on KC Cares.